If you've been watching Edgar Cayce Narratives for a while, welcome back. It's good to have you here again. And if this is your first time, this channel explores patterns in your life that feel real but are often hard to explain clearly. There's a moment that doesn't make sense the first time you notice it, and it usually happens when something good is about to happen in your life. When you are offered a promotion, or someone asks you to lead, or people start turning to you as the person with influence. And instead of feeling ready or even curious, something inside you quietly steps back. You don't panic, and you are not confused about your ability because you already know you can do it. And that is exactly what makes the situation feel strange, because the hesitation does not come from doubt. It comes from somewhere harder to describe. Something that feels like a boundary you should not cross. You hear yourself saying things like, "I'm not ready yet," or "maybe someone else should take this," even when the situation clearly points to you. And even when a part of you knows that stepping forward would make sense. From the outside, this looks like modesty or caution, but from the inside, it feels more specific than that, because it feels like stepping into power is not just a decision. It feels like entering a space that carries weight you are not fully comfortable holding. So the real question is not whether you are capable of power, but why something in you keeps choosing to stay away from it. To understand this clearly, we need to slow down and look at the pattern itself. Not just one moment, but how it repeats across different situations in your life. Because this is not about a single decision. It is about a consistent response that shows up whenever power becomes an option. It often starts in very normal situations, where someone recognizes your ability and gives you more responsibility, or where a gap appears and you are the obvious person to step in, or where people begin to trust your judgment and look to you for direction. And each time this happens, there is a small pause inside you that feels out of proportion to the situation. Instead of moving forward naturally, you begin to delay the decision. You say you need more time, you suggest alternatives, or you shift the focus to someone else who could take the role. And on the surface, this looks reasonable. But if you look closely, the same pattern keeps repeating, even when the circumstances are different. You might tell yourself that you simply prefer a quieter role, or that you do not want the pressure, or that leadership is not something you are interested in. And these explanations can feel true in the moment, but they do not fully explain why the reaction is so consistent, especially when you continue to show competence in everything you do. There are also moments where you step forward briefly and then pull back, where you accept responsibility but quickly reduce your visibility, or where you lead in a limited way but avoid taking full control. And these partial steps reveal something important, because they show that the issue is not ability. It is the level of power you are willing to hold. Over time, this creates a quiet pattern that is easy to miss, because nothing dramatic happens. You still succeed, you still move forward in life, but you remain just outside positions of real influence. And if someone were to look at your path, they might say you are being careful or selective, while you feel something more specific that you cannot fully explain. And the most important part is this: the feeling does not come from fear in the usual sense. It is not the fear of failing, and it is not the fear of being judged, because those fears usually push people to prepare more or prove themselves. But in this case, the feeling pulls you away from the situation entirely, as if stepping into power is not just difficult, it is somehow not right for you. So before we try to explain why this happens, we need to recognize the pattern for what it is: a repeated decision to stay slightly behind your own capability. Not because you lack something, but because something about power itself does not feel safe to hold. Let's look at how this pattern plays out in a real situation, because it is easier to understand when you can see it through one person's experience instead of just describing it in general terms. There is someone who has always been seen as reliable, the kind of person people trust without needing to question. and over time they become the one others turn to when something needs to be handled properly. Not because they ask for attention, but because their actions make it clear they can handle responsibility without creating problems. At work, this shows up early, when small responsibilities are given to them and they handle each one carefully. They think things through, they avoid mistakes, and they make decisions that consider how others will be affected. And because of this, people begin to notice that they are not just capable, they are consistent in a way that feels safe. Eventually, an opportunity appears that is different from the smaller tasks they are used to, something like a team lead position or a project that requires someone to make final decisions. And when this is offered to them, the reaction is not what others expect, because instead of stepping forward, they pause longer than necessary. They do not reject the opportunity immediately, and they do not say they cannot do it, but they begin to create distance in subtle ways. They ask for more time to think. They point out reasons why someone else might be a better fit, and they lower the importance of their own role in the situation. Even though the people offering the opportunity clearly see them as the right choice. Inside, the experience feels even more specific because there is no confusion about ability. They can already imagine how they would handle the role. They can see the steps, the decisions, and the outcomes. But alongside that clarity, there is a quiet resistance that does not match the situation. A sense that stepping into that position would carry something heavier than it appears on the surface. So they choose not to take it. And the decision seems reasonable when explained out loud. They say they prefer to focus on their current work, or that they are not interested in managing others, or that the timing is not right. And people accept these reasons because they sound practical. But the pattern does not end there. Time passes, and similar situations appear again, sometimes in different forms, sometimes in different environments. But the structure is the same. More responsibility, more influence, more visibility. And each time the same hesitation returns. Not dramatic, not emotional, but steady and consistent. There are also moments where they accept a smaller version of leadership, where they guide others informally, where they take responsibility without the title. And in those moments they perform well. They make thoughtful decisions. They support others. And everything functions smoothly. But when the role shifts from influence to authority, something changes again. They begin to step back in small ways. They avoid making final decisions when possible. They defer to others even when they have a clearer understanding. And they reduce their presence just enough to avoid becoming the central figure. And this happens so subtly that most people do not notice it as avoidance. They simply see it as a personality trait. Over time, the consequences are not dramatic, but they are real. Because while others move into positions of leadership and shape the direction of projects or teams, this person remains in a supportive role, respected and trusted, but not fully seen for the level of capability they actually have. There are quiet moments when this becomes visible to them, when they see someone else in a position they could have taken, and they recognize that they would have handled it differently, maybe more carefully, maybe more fairly. And in those moments, there is a brief sense of tension, not regret exactly, but a recognition that something in their own behavior has shaped this outcome. Even then, the pattern does not immediately change, because the hesitation is not based on logic alone. It is not something that can be resolved just by deciding differently once, because each new opportunity triggers the same internal response, the same pause, the same sense that stepping into full power carries a kind of weight that is difficult to accept. And what makes this pattern difficult to understand is that from the outside, everything looks stable. There is no obvious failure, no clear mistake, no event that explains why this person would avoid leadership. But from the inside, the consistency of the response, suggests that something deeper is shaping the decision every time. So the story is not about someone who lacks ability or someone who is afraid in the usual sense. It is about someone who repeatedly chooses to stay just below the level of power they are capable of holding, and who cannot fully explain why that choice feels necessary, even as it continues to shape the direction of their life. When you step back and look at this kind of story over a longer period of time, what becomes clear is that this is not a series of separate decisions. It is one consistent pattern repeating in different forms, and the details may change depending on the situation, but the response remains almost identical. It shows up in work when leadership becomes available. It appears in relationships when one person naturally takes a guiding role, and it even shows up in small, everyday situations where influence is subtle but still present. And in each case, the same internal movement happens. A brief recognition that you could step forward, followed by a quiet decision not to. At first, this can be easy to explain away, because each situation has its own context, and it is always possible to find a practical reason for stepping back. Maybe the timing is not right. Maybe the environment is not ideal. Maybe someone else is more experienced. And each explanation makes sense on its own, which is why the pattern can remain hidden for a long time. But when these moments are placed side by side, a different picture starts to form, because the pattern does not depend on external conditions. It appears whether the opportunity is large or small, whether the risk is high or low, and whether the outcome is certain or uncertain. And that consistency suggests that the source of the behavior is internal, not situational. There is also a specific structure to the pattern that becomes easier to recognize over time, because it often follows the same sequence. First, there is recognition, where you clearly see that you are capable and that stepping forward would make sense. Then there is hesitation, where something slows you down without fully stopping you. And finally, there is redirection, where the opportunity moves away from you either by your choice or by circumstances you quietly allow. What makes this more noticeable is that the pattern does not disappear even after positive reinforcement. Because even when you succeed in situations where you take partial responsibility, and even when others respond well to your input, the same hesitation returns when the level of power increases. And this shows that the pattern is not corrected by success in the usual way. Over time, this creates a kind of invisible boundary in your life. Not a fixed limit that you consciously choose, but a level you rarely move beyond. And everything below that level feels manageable and acceptable, while anything above it triggers the same subtle resistance that leads you to step back again. And the most important realization in this stage is that this pattern is not random, it is not occasional, and it is not dependent on how confident you feel in a given moment, because it continues to appear even when you are prepared, even when you are supported, and even when the situation clearly aligns in your favor. So instead of asking why a single opportunity did not work out, the question begins to shift into something more precise. Why does the same response keep happening across different areas of your life? And what is it about power itself that consistently leads you to stay just outside of it, even when everything suggests that you could step into it without difficulty? At this point, the pattern is clear, but what matters more is the tension inside it, because this is where the experience becomes difficult to ignore, and it is also where most common explanations start to fall apart. The first instinct is to call this a confidence issue, but that does not fully hold up, because in many areas of your life, you are already confident. You handle complex tasks, you make decisions, and you trust your own judgment. So the hesitation does not come from a general lack of belief in yourself. It also does not behave like fear in the usual sense, because typical fear pushes people in a specific direction. It makes them over-prepare. It makes them try harder to prove themselves. or it makes them avoid situations where they feel they might fail. But in this case, the reaction is different because it does not push you to improve or retreat completely. It simply pulls you away from positions of higher influence. There is also a noticeable absence of urgency in the way you respond. Because when people are afraid of failing, they often feel pressure. They think about what could go wrong, and they experience a clear emotional reaction. But here, the feeling is quieter, more controlled, and harder to define, almost like a calm decision that still carries a sense of weight. This is where the contradiction becomes more visible. Because on one side, you can clearly see that you are capable, you understand what needs to be done, and you know that stepping forward would make sense. But on the other side, something in you resists that step in a way that does not match your actual ability. You might even say to yourself, "I could do this if I wanted to." And that statement is true, but it is immediately followed by a second thought that is harder to explain. "I just don't want to." And the gap between those two statements is where the tension exists. What makes this more complex is that the resistance is not directed at effort or difficulty, because you are willing to work hard, you are willing to take responsibility in controlled ways, and you are willing to support others. But when the role shifts into one where your decisions directly shape outcomes for other people, the resistance becomes stronger. It begins to feel less like a practical choice and more like a boundary, as if there is a line that separates what feels acceptable from what does not. And crossing that line is not just about taking on more work. It feels like taking on something you are not entirely comfortable holding. And this is the key point where the usual explanations stop being enough. Because if it is not a lack of confidence, and it is not a typical fear of failure, then the question becomes more specific. What exactly about power creates this kind of resistance? And why does it feel less like a challenge to overcome, and more like something you are choosing to stay away from? Up to this point, everything we've looked at can be observed directly in behavior, but it does not fully explain why the reaction feels so specific. And this is where Edgar Cayce's perspective offers a different way to interpret what is happening. Not as a belief you need to accept, but as a lens that can make the pattern more coherent. In Cayce's readings, there are many cases where individuals show strong reactions to certain roles or situations, not because of what is happening in their current life alone, but because of experiences that are described as coming from previous lifetimes, especially in situations where they held influence, authority, or responsibility over others. In those cases, the focus is not just on having power, but on what was done with it. Because having authority means making decisions that affect other people, and those decisions can lead to outcomes that are not always balanced, even when the intention was not harmful. Some readings describe individuals who were in positions where their choices shaped the direction of groups, communities, or systems, and in those roles, even a small decision could have wide consequences. And over time, those consequences could lead to imbalance, harm, or loss, not always in obvious ways, but in ways that affected other lives. What matters here is not the specific historical detail, but the structure of the experience. Because when someone is repeatedly placed in a position where their decisions carry weight, they also carry the results of those decisions. And according to Cayce's perspective, that experience does not simply disappear, it leaves an imprint. This imprint is not presented as a clear memory that you can recall directly, but as a tendency, a sensitivity, or a reaction that appears in later experiences, especially when similar conditions arise. And this is where the connection to the present pattern becomes more visible. If someone has experienced the weight of authority in a way that led to outcomes they later recognized as harmful or unbalanced, then the idea of stepping back into a position of power would not feel neutral. It would carry an association, even if that association is not consciously understood. In this framework, Power is no longer just an opportunity or a role. It becomes something connected to consequence, something that has already been experienced as having an impact beyond intention. And because of that, the response to power in the present moment is not based only on the current situation. It is influenced by a deeper layer of association. This can explain why the reaction does not look like typical fear, because it is not about what might go wrong in the future in a general sense. It is about something that feels already known at a deeper level. Something that suggests that stepping into power is not just a challenge. It is a position that carries responsibility in a way that feels heavy before anything has even happened. It also explains why the resistance is specific to influence rather than effort. Because the issue is not working hard or taking on tasks. It is being in a position where your decisions shape outcomes for others, and where those outcomes may extend beyond what you can fully control. From this perspective, the hesitation we observed earlier is not random, and it is not simply a personality trait. It is a form of avoidance that has a structure, and that structure is tied to the meaning of power itself, not just the situation in front of you. This does not mean that every instance of hesitation must be explained in this way, and it does not require you to accept the idea of past lives as a fixed truth. But it offers a way to understand why the pattern feels consistent, why it appears across different areas of life, and why it is not easily changed by logic alone. It also brings clarity to the internal statement we saw earlier: I could do it, but I don't want to. Because in this context, the lack of desire is not about preference, it is about association. And that association links power with consequence in a way that makes stepping forward feel like entering a space that already carries meaning. And once that connection is considered, the pattern begins to make more sense. Because the avoidance is no longer about avoiding effort or risk. It becomes about avoiding the possibility of repeating an experience that, at some level, still feels unresolved. Once you look at this pattern through that lens, it stops being a single personal story and starts to appear in many different forms. And what makes it difficult to recognize is that it does not always look like avoidance of power in an obvious way. It often shows up in subtle behaviors that seem unrelated at first. In some people, it appears as a consistent preference to stay in supporting roles, even when they are clearly capable of leading, and they become the person who keeps everything running smoothly behind the scenes, who solves problems quietly, and who makes sure others succeed, but rarely positions themselves as the one making the final decisions. In other cases, it shows up as a reluctance to take responsibility for outcomes that affect others, even in small ways, where someone might avoid giving direction, avoid setting boundaries, or avoid making choices that would place them in a position of influence. And they explain this as wanting to keep things simple or avoid conflict. But the pattern repeats even when those concerns are minimal. There are also situations where people accept roles that involve influence but limit how far they step into them, where they guide but do not fully lead, where they contribute but do not take ownership, and where they remain present but not central. And this partial engagement creates a balance that feels safer, even if it also limits what they could fully do. What connects all of these variations is not a lack of ability or even a lack of interest, because in many cases, these individuals care deeply about the outcome. They think carefully about decisions, and they often have a strong sense of fairness, which actually makes them well-suited for positions of influence. This is where the distinction becomes important, because what we are looking at is not the fear of failure, and it is not the fear of being seen. It is closer to a resistance to impact, a hesitation to be the person whose decisions shape the direction of others' experiences. That is why the pattern can exist even in people who are confident, capable, and respected. Because the issue is not whether they can handle responsibility, it is whether they are comfortable being the source of consequences that extend beyond themselves. And when you look at it this way, you can begin to see how the same underlying structure appears across very different lives, because the external situations may vary, but the internal response follows the same logic. Recognizing the possibility of influence, feeling a subtle resistance, and choosing a position that reduces direct impact. This also explains why the pattern is often misunderstood, both by the person experiencing it and by others around them. Because from the outside, it can look like humility, caution, or even lack of ambition, while from the inside, it feels like a very specific boundary that is difficult to explain without sounding unclear. Over time, this can shape the direction of a person's life in ways that are not immediately obvious, because they continue to move forward, they continue to succeed, and they continue to contribute. But they do so within a range that keeps them just outside positions where their influence would be fully expressed. And the more this repeats, the more it begins to feel natural, not because it fully satisfies them, but because it avoids a type of discomfort that is harder to define. And that discomfort is not tied to effort or pressure. It is tied to the idea of being the one whose decisions carry weight. So what begins as a subtle hesitation gradually becomes a consistent way of moving through life. And unless it is recognized clearly, it can continue indefinitely, shaping choices in ways that feel reasonable in each moment, but form a pattern that is much more structured when seen as a whole. To make sense of this without relying only on one perspective, it helps to look at how modern psychology describes similar patterns, because there are concepts that come close to what we are seeing, even if they do not fully capture the depth of it. One common explanation is leadership anxiety, where individuals feel discomfort when placed in positions of authority, especially when they are responsible for guiding others or making decisions that affect outcomes. And this can create hesitation, avoidance, or a preference for roles that feel less exposed. Another related idea is responsibility sensitivity, where someone becomes highly aware of the impact their actions can have on other people, and because of that awareness, they become more cautious, more careful, and sometimes more reluctant to take on roles where their decisions carry weight. There is also the concept of guilt anticipation, where a person unconsciously expects that their actions could lead to negative consequences for others, even if there is no clear reason to believe that will happen in the current situation. And this expectation can create a quiet form of avoidance that does not look like fear, but still shapes behavior. All of these ideas help explain parts of the pattern, because they show how a person can be capable and still hesitate when faced with influence. But they usually focus on current life experiences, learned behavior, or emotional conditioning, and they often assume that the source of the reaction can be traced back to something that happened within this lifetime. What they do not fully explain is the consistency and specificity of the pattern we described earlier, because in many cases, there is no clear event in the present that justifies such a precise response to power itself, especially when the individual does not show the same level of hesitation in other areas. This is where the psychological view and the Cayce perspective can be placed side by side, not to compete with each other, but to show two different ways of describing the same experience, one focusing on observable behavior and emotional patterns, and the other suggesting that the origin of those patterns may extend beyond what is immediately visible. From a practical standpoint, both perspectives point to the same core idea, that the reaction is not random and it is not a simple lack of confidence. It is a structured response shaped by how the individual relates to impact, responsibility, and consequence. And when you combine these views, the pattern becomes easier to recognize without needing to force a single explanation, because you can see that the hesitation has both a psychological structure and a deeper layer of meaning, whether you interpret that meaning as memory, conditioning, or something else. This grounded view is important because it keeps the discussion connected to real behavior, real decisions, and real experiences, while still allowing space for a broader interpretation of why the pattern feels so consistent and so difficult to change. So instead of choosing between psychology and Cayce's interpretation, it becomes more useful to see how both are describing the same tension from different angles, and how that tension continues to shape the way someone responds to power, even when everything on the surface suggests they should be able to step into it without hesitation. At this point, the pattern, the tension, and the possible explanations all point toward one central realization, and it is simpler than it first appears, but it changes how you interpret everything that came before. The hesitation is not a weakness, and it is not a lack of ambition, because if it were, it would show up across all areas of your life. But here it appears in a very specific place, only when your role begins to carry influence over others, and when your decisions start to shape outcomes beyond yourself. What this suggests is that your relationship with power is not neutral, because power is not experienced by you as just an opportunity or a position. It is experienced as something that carries weight, meaning, and consequence, even before anything has actually happened in the present moment. In that sense, the avoidance is not about rejecting success. It is about avoiding a type of responsibility that feels different from normal effort, because it involves being the source of change in other people's lives. And that is where the resistance becomes consistent. So the key insight is this: power is not just a role you step into. It is something your mind already associates with impact. And that association shapes your decisions in ways that feel natural in each moment, even if they limit you over time. And once you see it clearly, the pattern stops looking random or confusing, because it becomes a logical response based on how power is defined internally, not by what it is in the current situation, but by what it has come to represent to you over time. Now the focus shifts back to you not as an abstract idea, but as a way to look at your own experiences with more clarity. Because patterns like this often become visible only when you step back and connect moments that once felt unrelated. Think about the times when you were close to stepping into a position of influence. Not just the obvious ones, but also the smaller situations, where your voice could have shaped the outcome. And notice whether there was a familiar pause, a moment where you could have moved forward, but chose not to without fully explaining why. Look at how often this has happened, and whether it follows the same structure each time: recognition, hesitation, and then a quiet shift away from being the one who leads or decides. And consider whether the reasons you gave in those moments fully explain the consistency of the pattern. Also pay attention to how you feel when you imagine stepping fully into a position of power now. Not just the practical aspects, but the internal response, whether it feels neutral or whether it carries a sense of weight that is difficult to define but still present. This is not about judging those choices or trying to change them immediately, because the first step is simply to see the pattern clearly, to recognize that the hesitation may have a structure and a meaning that goes beyond the surface explanation. And once you can see it without dismissing it, you can begin to ask a more honest question. Not, can I do this? But what does power actually mean to me? And why does it feel the way it does when I get close to it? If this pattern felt familiar to you, then you're already doing the most important part, which is noticing it clearly instead of explaining it away. Because once you can see how it repeats, you start to understand that your choices may be shaped by something deeper than the situation in front of you. You don't need to force yourself into power or push against the hesitation immediately, because the goal here is not to react. It is to understand what the hesitation is connected to and what meaning power holds for you before you decide what to do with it. If you've experienced moments like this in your own life, or if there's a situation you're still trying to understand, share it in the comments. Because seeing how this pattern shows up in different people often makes it easier to recognize in yourself. And if this video helped you see something more clearly, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to Edgar Cayce Narratives. And you can also tell me what topic you want to explore next, especially if there's a pattern in your life that doesn't fully make sense yet.